This week we're going to start talking about the acoustic realm. In music technology, there are a variety of realms that we work with without even ever really noticing. We typically go about our lives using cellular phones or devices like iPads or computers or even any sort of sound-making device, electronic device, is a digital device, right? They have memory, they have screens, and they digitize our sounds. That is a separate realm of sound that is unlike the others that we're going to talk about this module, because the digitization of sound is the end result, but first it must occur in two other realms, and those are more important in my view. The first of those realms is the acoustic realm, and that's what we'll talk about this week. And next we will talk about electric analog. That is the second realm, and that is extremely important. So our first week here is going to be talking about acoustics and sound, and waveforms, and frequency, and amplitude. I typically start by showing a picture of this composer. Her name's Hildur. She recently won an Oscar for her work in for the movie The Joker and Chernobyl. And I like to start with this image because of a couple of reasons. First reason is that it really showcases how studios have evolved from these massive, very expensive, lots of equipment, sorts of otherworldly realms to a place that is you can have in a small apartment. Hildur is a very renowned composer for film, yet her workspace is very modest and accessible. It's a simple desk with, it's actually a pretty great computer over here, but that's not simple. It's actually a pretty expensive computer. But she's got studio monitors and a screen and a MIDI controller and a microphone and a musical instrument, an acoustic musical instrument. And this has most of what we have in the computer lab, and it is most of what I have here at home. It's a simple economic setup. And for any of us in this class, this kind of setup is attainable over time through the accumulation of things here and there, a little bit of expertise here and there, and it's a gradual process. So I just want to encourage you to, this is a starting point for what can be an evolution of your experience that can grow outward to become whatever you want it to be. So we're going to start with the acoustic realm this week, which is this guy over here, this cello. And so acoustically, what happens is when a sound is created from a vibrating source, it activates the air molecules in the air around us. And those occurrences are basically sending out airwaves or air pressure changes throughout the air around us. Our ears are very special and awesome musical instruments because they're basically tiny barometers. Our ears detect changes in air pressure over time. And they're very, very nuanced, very delicate and awesome and very powerful barometers. Those air molecules that compress and refract over time do so in a very minute and minuscule way in the air. And our ears detect those changes in air pressure. When our ears detect those changes in air pressure, they turn those changes in air pressure into neurological impulses in our brain. And so that is done through all these little pieces of the inner ear. When it reaches our brain, it becomes a sound. We perceive certain things as sounds. In psychoacoustics, we basically understand how the brain decodes and analyzes nerve impulses, and we describe how people hear and perceive sound. This is an important distinction to make because humans experience sound differently than other animals. Inanimate objects, of course, don't hear. And so the old saying goes, if the tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Well, technically, a tree falling in the forest will excite the air molecules around it, but it's not a sound unless those changes in air pressure in the air molecules around it are detected by ears. So technically, it doesn't make a sound unless there's an ear and a brain to detect it. So that's where psychoacoustics comes in. It's very, very important to understand that these changes in air pressure around us are being encoded by our ears, and our brains perceive things as sounds. And so when a vibrating source activates the air molecules around us, it creates what are called compressions and rarefactions in the air molecules around us. It's like a pool of water. Air molecules are like water molecules in that they ebb and flow. That ebb and flow of air molecules happens in a nanosecond, and it's very minuscule. These compressions and rarefactions are what create what we know as waves. If those waves occur in a regular pattern, we perceive them as pitch, and we can represent them in a two-dimensional way with a waveform. The waveform is a way to visualize what happens in the physical realm, how we visualize this compression and rarefaction of air molecules over time. Obviously, air molecules are invisible to us. We don't see them, but we hear the effects. Musical instruments, acoustic ones, all require different kinds of vibrations to make sound. And next week, I'll ask you to describe that process. And we'll talk about that next week when we talk about timbre as well. But all analog musical instruments require vibrations and resonance. Basically, how the sound begins. On a piano, it's a mechanical process of striking a key on a piano, and then that piano key strikes a hammer, and that hammer strikes a string, and that string is what we hear as a vibrating source. That string resonates against a soundboard inside that piano and activates the air molecules around the soundboard and makes it louder. The cabinet of the piano also has something to do with the sound of the piano as well. In all different kinds of instruments, the sound doesn't occur unless it is passed through a certain type of material. In a trumpet, for instance, we blow air into the trumpet. The air column is what vibrates inside that trumpet, and then that is extended out as the air vibrates around it, and then it is detected by our ears as sound. Until our ears are a part of that process, it is nothing but changes in air pressure. Our ears and our brains need to be connected and listening for that to sound and for us to perceive it as a note. So waveforms are ways for us to visualize sound. If we're going to be working with sound in any meaningful way, we have to be able to visualize something that is not something we see. And so doing that creates a waveform in which we can see not only the amplitude of a waveform, but the frequency. And we'll talk about what those two things mean. So this represents one compression and rarefaction of air molecules. Picture your hand in a pool of water. When you push that water with your hand, it creates this vacuum behind it. So for every push, there's a pull. There's an ebb and a flow. That is exactly what compression and rarefaction means. When something vibrates, it vibrates back and forth. And the waveform represents one push and one pull of that energy, of those air molecules. And we make that distinction between how many times there's a push and pull of air pressure over any certain amount of time. Frequency is the rate at which a full cycle of a waveform repeats. It is how we measure pitch. And pitch is determined by the amount of compressions and rarefactions per second of a waveform. If we go back to our example here, this example shows us 1 compression and rarefaction in 1 second. So that means it has an extremely low frequency, something that we cannot detect as humans. And it's determined by the length of the waveform, and we measure a frequency in hertz. This is a way for us to objectively measure sound. By objective, meaning we can measure it and put a number on it. Subjective measurement of sound is like, oh, that sounds high to me. I think that is a high sound or that is a low sound. Well, a frequency is objective and it's measured, and there's no doubt about it that this sound has a certain frequency. Even the note C sharp, that isn't a subjective understanding of a sound. A C sharp can be all these different types of frequencies. But a frequency is a frequency, and there is really no other way to describe it. Humans are only able to hear or perceive sounds that are within a certain range. And this is a very important sort of fundamental of any audio class, is understanding the human hearing range. The human hearing range, the range at which humans perceive sound, is from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. 20 cycles per second to 20,000 cycles per second. There are waveforms all around us that are vibrating at either lower or higher values. But as humans, these are the only ones we can hear and perceive as sound. It's important to remember. Anything below 20 hertz is sub-audio. So a subwoofer is designed to reproduce sounds below that range. Ultrasonic sound are waveforms that are vibrating faster than 20,000 hertz. This table shows us sort of how the frequencies of each key on a keyboard translate to notes, and that is only sort of interesting if you think about octaves. So let's look at a let's find. Well, this keyboard isn't really going to be very useful. Maybe, let me see, 110. This A is 110. An octave above that is 220. An octave above that is 440. So octaves have whole number multiples of their frequencies. Just to have a little fun with frequency range as well, we can see that this chart shows different animals and the way that they hear frequency. If you find human there, right above chinchilla, it's the purple line from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Other animals have different frequency ranges. If we look at I have a dog, so we're gonna find dog here. My dog Eddie hears frequencies slightly above, right, up to almost 100,000 kilohertz. Or 100 hertz. I'm sorry, 100 kilohertz, excuse me. So he can hear sounds much above mine. And so everybody's got a unique way of perceiving sound. So frequency is an extremely important concept. We measure it in hertz. It is how we objectively measure pitch. And we describe the amount of cycles per second as hertz, and if it's over 1,000 hertz is a kilohertz, and we measure it in that way. Amplitude is the other way that we measure sound in a waveform. So we've talked about the frequency realm. Let's look at the amplitude realm. The amplitude realm is one in which we measure the amount of air pressure in a waveform cycle as it deviates from zero. An objective measurement of loudness is amplitude. How much air does it move? If the sound is extremely loud, it'll move a lot of air molecules. If it's really quiet, it doesn't move hardly any. It does not affect the pitch. We can have very quiet high sounds and very quiet low sounds, but the amplitude, these are two unique measurements. It is basically, in general, the height of the waveform. And we objectively measure loudness in this way, and we measure them with decibels. And the dB SPL amplitude thresholds to remember, much like the human hearing range is something to remember, the amplitude thresholds are also something to remember. We hear the threshold of hearing as 0 dB. That is a theoretical construct because technically we can never not hear something as human beings. If we are alive, we are always hearing something. If you put yourself in a anechoic chamber or a soundproof booth, you can hear your own nervous system, you can hear your own breathing, your heart, you can hear your body make vibrations just from living. And so theoretically, the threshold of hearing is 0 dB, meaning that's the silence. The threshold of pain is 120 decibels. And this slide shows us a bit of how to reference that scale. So if our threshold of hearing is 0, listening to pleasant chamber music is about 80 decibels. A train whistle, 90 decibels. A loud piano and so on. So that's kind of a comfortable sound realm, okay? Once we get up into these higher ranges, we get into closer to the threshold of pain, and this is where damage can occur in your eardrums. And this is the point at which I really advocate for hearing protection when you're either working with loud equipment or performing or attending loud concerts. Or if you're riding in a vehicle with a loud stereo system, you can really do some permanent damage to your hearing. And as musicians and as music lovers, that is something we want to preserve. So take care of your most important musical instrument. Take care of your ears. So we can also identify basically how much exposure can really do some damage to your hearing health. And so just basically a 82 decibels, which is was a loud piano. So basically you're looking at a longer period of time. However, the higher you go, the shorter the amount of time exposure is optimal before damage is done. So this is an equal loudness curve, and this is where we'll stop today, but this is an extremely important sort of model to view in terms of demonstrating what psychoacoustics really means. So this is how we perceive constant loudness, and this is a slightly strange little graph, but if this is SPL or amplitude, and this is the amount of frequency or hertz, we can see that nothing is straight across for how we perceive. So how we perceive sound. So that means that a 90 decibel sound, as we go up the frequency spectrum, these sounds seem to be similarly perceived in loudness. However, as they only are perceived to be as loud as they are because they have been increased in decibels. So picture yourself holding the volume knob on a sound, on a constant sound. As you go up, that sound decreases or increases in intensity, meaning that you have to lower the volume in order for it to remain equal. We are most sensitive around this range. If you look at this range from about 5K to 8K, this is our sort of our optimal bandwidth of sound. That's where the human hearing or the human voice lives. Our brains are tuned to hear the human voice the best, right? Especially high ones. So the higher frequency voices like small children, even the sound of a crying baby, that can be very piercing because our ears are really sensitive to that frequency spectrum, right? Loud bells, alarms, sirens, things like that. However, lower frequency sounds are more mellow, and we perceive them as mellower or as lower in intensity because that's the way our brains perceive the intensity of that sound. So things to keep in mind, we'll probably review this back when we talk about mixing later in the course, because when we look at the frequency spectrum of our sounds in our mix, the ones that are in this range don't need as much help. The lower frequencies may need more help to remain equal, to make an equal mix, but our higher frequencies are already intense to the human brain, so we don't need to give them more help. So this equal loudness curve helps us hear, or helps us understand what is already intense in terms of what our brains perceive. Okay, I believe we'll stop here this week with loudness and with frequency and amplitude. We talked about how the acoustic realm is an important discussion when we start talking about music technology. And when we go forward into timbre next week, we'll talk about how sound is shaped and is color, how color is brought into the equation. And eventually we'll start talking about how we work with the conversion from the acoustic realm to the electrical realm or the analog realm. So thank you.